All right. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to this week's APL Readers Corner. I have Tessie here with me. My name is Nicole. And yeah, okay. So welcome to APL Readers Corner. This is a book discussion review for those who have never tuned in before. We choose books based on a different genre each week, and we also choose them from our digital collection called Hoopla because they all the titles are available right away, so you can read along with us, or once you have finished watching this, you can check out the book and read it for yourself. Like I said, we choose a different genre each week, and we kind of discuss the different aspects of each genre along with the book that we read. Those of you watching, you can join in, ask questions. You can post them in the comments, and we'll be sure to answer them. This week, we are looking at Westerns, and we read the book Desperadoes by Hansen.
Now, Westerns are a really interesting genre. It's not a genre that I prefer. I don't know about you, Nicole. Is this the first Western you've ever read?
It's actually the second Western I read, but yeah, I don't read a lot of Westerns. A lot of movies, though.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of movies that are Westerns, and I know some people, they like the Louis and L'Amour, like they're really those thin paperback Westerns that go on for on and on and on. So I know as a genre, it's super popular. But it's so interesting that Westerns are just based on a time period of American history that is very short. So it's a time period between the end of the Civil War, which ended in 1865, and then basically the very beginning of the 1900s. So like 1901, 1902, just a couple years past that when America started modernizing a little bit before World War I. But it's a very small period, and it's characterized by the fact that during this time period, so after the Civil War and kind of near the end of the Civil War, America was driving out the Native Americans in the western states. And so there's a huge land grab by white settlers. And so you had this rush of white settlers coming out into the West, and you had Native Americans who were still there clashing. And so that was like a backdrop of the Western. A lot of other elements of the Western that you can find is cowboys, a lot of lawlessness, just because the fact that you have a whole group of people moving into this, what was uninhabited by at least Americans. They are so far from what is the rule of law in the East, so they have to kind of just set up law and order. And so that gradual setting up of law and order and making look like things a civilization is also a backdrop to this. So you have a lot of outlaws, people taking advantage of systems that are new, which is really interesting because in Desperadoes, maybe if I'll remember, I'll mention it, the fact that they were taking advantage of new technology because there's the railroads coming out there were banks, and they were figuring out, oh, I could use this and rob it because they don't have structures in place to protect it, which I thought was really interesting. You have sheriffs, you have the Native Americans. A lot of Westerns, though, are very discriminatory towards Native Americans. Even in this book, it's really prevalent. So if you don't like listening to that or reading it, I would avoid Westerns. There's pioneers, kind of references to the Civil War because it just happened. Depending on where you are, there's ranches, there's saloons, there's shootouts, so all of that fun stuff. And there's obviously the outlaw gangs. So in Desperadoes, the main gang is going to be the Dalton gang, the Dalton group, which is pretty famous. But yeah, so that's basically the gist of what a Western is those elements of it inside of it.
Yeah, so then going into that, the book Desperadoes is, the summary for this book is in the eyes of Emmett Dalton, one of the younger Dalton brothers from the infamous Dalton gang. So at age 65, Emmett Dalton is the sole survivor of the infamous Dalton gang, and he made a living by selling his outrageous adventure stories to Hollywood. So it's detailing his memories of the different murders, the bootlegging, and the thievery he and his posse committed. And I felt like all the heists that they were performing was leading up to the eventual real historical event of the dual bank robbery that was performed by the Dalton gang, which ultimately led to their demise. Emmett was one of the last surviving ones. He was actually wounded, captured, and then convicted. And then he ended up going out on parole, and he only served, I think, 14 years in prison. Interesting fact, I guess, Emmett Dalton did write a book called When the Daltons Rode in 1931. However, his other brother, Lit, mentioned that a lot of the details in his book were fabricated. So I have a feeling that Ron Hansen took a little bit of inspiration from historical events and Emmett's own accounts of the stories. Now, Ron Hansen, he was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1947. He earned a bachelor's degree from Creighton University in Omaha in 1970. He then earned a master's of fine arts from the Iowa's Writer Workshop in 1974 following his military service. He has received a Wallace Stegner Creative Writing Fellowship from Stanford. He earned another Master of Arts in Spirituality from Santa Clara University. Then in 2007, he was ordained as a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church. In 2009, inducted to the College of Fellows at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. Desperadoes was actually his first novel. He wrote it in 1979. His next novel is probably his most popular work, and it was The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford in 1983. It was nominated for the PEN/Faulkner Award, and in 2007, it was adapted to a film which starred Brad Pitt.
No, I have not read that book, The Assassination of Jesse James, but I feel like after reading this book, I definitely want to read it. But in general, as his first book, Desperadoes, has pretty good reviews. In Amazon, it has basically a 4 out of 5. Goodreads gives it, if you round up, a 4 out of 5. And then Hoopla also gives it a 4 out of 5. So it's a really well-rated book, and I feel like as a Western, it's very, very good. Like, it's very informative. It's very detailed, and so that's what makes me want to read The Assassination of Jesse James, just because I feel like I'm going to get more of that Western detail, because I feel like he researched it really well. But I like the book. Did you like the book, Nicole?
I like parts of it. Once I found out it was actually like about the Dalton brothers gang, like they were real, I was like, ooh, this is kind of cool, especially because it was written from someone in the gang's perspective, not an outside source, so that was kind of cool. I loved learning about their different heists, especially the train robberies, and then ultimately the bank robberies, and all the events leading up to it. But like you said, he's very descriptive, and I felt like a lot of times it was a lot of info dumping. And there were certain parts where they're sitting in their hideouts and he's, going into long detail about certain stuff. And there were a lot of people that were introduced into the gangs. I mean, not only were the Dalton brothers, but there were other people in the gang, and it was hard to keep track. I got, like we said before, I got Grat and Blackface Charlie Bryan. Like, I thought they were the same person. I got them confused. Bill and Bob Dalton, I'd have to like really read to remember who was who, because they both play different parts in this game, So it was good, but I probably, I wouldn't pick up a lot of Westerns.
Yeah. I feel like I did like the info dumping. Like, I tend to like those kind of books only if it's like informative and educational, and because I don't read Westerns, I know nothing about that time period. So I was like, oh, I'm learning all these new things. But it did make reading it really slow. And then I was really impressed by all the heists. Like it was such, like they were doing heist after heist and they were succeeding to some, like even if they didn't succeed all the way, like even if they still like got money out of it, they still got away alive. And so by the end, like I was hoping that they would pull off that dual bank robbery. And
Yeah.
real life event, they did it. There are photos that you can find online about, like it's just photos of them after they were killed that people take photos with. Like it was like a big thing after they got killed. People came from miles away to come and see their bodies. It was sort of like a circus sort of thing, kind of morbid. But you can find those photos online, which I thought was really interesting. And it was like leading up to that point, they had been so successful. And then that last bank robbery just went total failure. But spoiler alert, it's because they got betrayed. I guess I won't say who because it's a big spoiler, but they got betrayed and that's why it just went so badly. But I was disappointed by that end just because I was like, it was just leading up to it. But I did like the book a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So for some of our discussion questions, tell us if you like the book, if you've read it before. If you haven't read it before, let us know if you want to read the book. But one of our first discussion question is, what was your initial reaction to the book? Do you have favorite parts? Do you think Emmett was a credible narrator?
Yeah, so at first when I was reading it, it starts off with Emmett Dalton in his 60s at one of his, I think it's after one of his movie premieres or something, where they're all at their house. And he's just kind of like in a daze where he's just, you can tell he's very bored with his life. So then he's looking at all his mementos. He has a scar from when he got shot. He has, I think, a pistol that he has just sitting in a glass case. And so he's looking at all these mementos, and that's when he starts going into his accounts of the different, of his journey in the Dalton gang. And at first I was kind of like, oh, maybe he's going to start being an outlaw in the, he's going to be an outlaw in his 60s because he misses it so much. No, he's just reminiscing. Probably my favorite part was, I was a little impressed when I think it was Bob Dalton that had the idea of robbing 2 banks at once because he wanted to put Jesse James to shame. And so I was like, wow, they had been robbing trains this entire time. So going to a bank, it was going to be very different because it's a stationary building. When you think of bank robberies, past that point when there's more technology, there's a lot that has to go into it. So I felt like, I was like, ooh, I wonder how this is going to play out, and maybe they're going to come out successful. I think they got a little lazy at this heist just because they didn't seem to have thought the plan through, especially because right at the end, Bob mentioned that him and Emmett were going into the wrong bank. Like the banks were switched. He thought they were going into the one and they were actually going into the other one. So I feel like maybe their plan backfired a little bit. So it seemed a little lazy at that point, that maybe, but also there was that ultimate betrayal by someone they knew that was very close to them. So that could have been another part of their demise. But yeah, the favorite part was him saying, we're going to rob 2 banks at once. I'm like, oh, I want to see how this works out. Emmett, as a credible narrator, I think so, yes, when you're looking at it in the novel standpoint, because he is right in the middle of it. You can hear how he feels about certain heists, where there was a certain point where he actually wanted to stop being an outlaw and just earn an actual living. And then he decides against it because I think he's bored and he's like, no, this is my life and this is what I enjoy. I would rather be doing this than just some honest work. But then when you learn about the Daltons being a real gang and the bank robbery being a real historical event, and then wondering if the book he wrote was fabricated as well. It's like, ooh, I wonder, can we trust him? But again, this is also in the eyes of Ron Hansen, in the eyes of Emmett Dalton. So I think in the book, I believe he is definitely more credible than probably someone from the outside.
I think definitely for the Western elements, he's credible. For some of the other things, I'm just like, I'm sure you're leaving some stuff out so you look like you're in a better light.
Ooh, yeah.
I feel that when he was going on his adventures, so a big theme of it was that he had a childhood sweetheart, Julia, who he eventually marries when he's older and is living with her in Hollywood, and they have a really nice life. But I feel like about his adventures, like they're always talking about like the different characters getting with like other women and stuff, and like you never hear about Emmett doing that. And I feel like he wanted, like, it might have just been Ron Hansen thinking that Emmett would have wanted to put himself in a better light, but he's always like, oh, my sweetheart Julia. Or maybe he was really as romantically inclined as he seemed in the book, which I thought was interesting. Like, I was thinking about that, and I was like, you seem to really love her. Like, you're just, like, writing her letters and courting her, and it's like, I was like, is that really a side to, like, a Dalton gang outlaw member, cowboy outlaw? But anyways, so I thought that was really interesting, and I feel like throughout the book there were parts of it where he was probably editing it to make himself look better, or Ron Hansen was editing it in a way that he thought Emmett would want to edit it in the way to make himself look better. And it's just like, I thought it was just a really interesting dynamic. But
yeah, he wanted to have one moral outlaw.
yeah, with that hint of morality, because there were a lot of times that I think as a character Bob, like he starts off, you say at the very beginning, like he was not a sheriff, but what was he? He was a marshal. He was a marshal. So he was the one in charge of going after outlaws after his brother, one of his eldest brother, Frank, I think, got killed by outlaws. And so
Yes.
Because Frank got killed by outlaws, the name of the Daltons as like sort of like good peacekeepers spread, and so he got a job as a marshal at a very young age. And so he starts being a marshal, and he's very by the rules. Like he's like, I want to be a good person, and it's like this slow descent into becoming an outlaw. At first, he starts like taking bribes, and then he starts like doing other stuff, and eventually it just slides all the way into like full outlawness. Like his morality starts being questioned because they kill people, and he seems not to care, even though Emmett's like, oh, like, did we do the right thing? But maybe Emmett was just pretending like he was having these moral conflicts. But as far as when we started reading the book, like my initial reaction when I started reading this is that, oh, I'm not going to like it because it's a Western. And then I started reading it, and I was like, oh, I actually really like this book. And my favorite parts, I feel, were like the very beginning heist. So when they were trying to figure out how to do the heists and like stealing the horses and like the first couple of train robberies, because it had like that element of excitement to it, and I think they were still excited by it. And then it started becoming routine, and then they did the bank robbery because it was like they were like, we need a final haul before we go to Argentina. And I was like, okay. They probably just should have saved their money and then used it to go to Argentina so they wouldn't get caught, but that's a different story. So for our next question is, what preconceptions do you have about the Old West? Did this book solidify or dispel them?
Oh, definitely. Well, we already talked about, some of the themes and characteristics of a Western, and watching a lot of Western, not a lot, but watching and having knowledge of Western films. I definitely had that preconceived notion of the wild, wild West, and the sheriffs and the outlaws, and the different heists. And obviously I didn't think about the train robberies being first. I always thought it would be the banks first and then the trains. So when they were talking about doing trains first and not, I'm like, why aren't you hitting the banks? Those are the ones that are just sitting with all the money. But, I'm not an outlaw, so I wouldn't know. So that was probably my preconceived notion, is that they were robbing the banks first. And that there were definitely, but I could see the idea of being a sheriff turning into an outlaw because, like you said, Bob was a marshal at first, but I think it was because it was such little money. By the time all the cuts were made, he got so little that I think he realized, he's like, I could probably make more if I stole, which yes and no. In the beginning, they definitely didn't. But then towards the end, they started tightening up their heists, and they were able to get more money in the end. But yes, definitely this book definitely was a Western and showed me the Wild Wild West, as I have already thought that it would be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I had just had a thought and then I lost it, but this is definitely a Western book, and it definitely solidified all of my ideas of what a Western is. And because it is fiction to an extent, I don't know how much of it is just playing off of stereotypes about Westerns, but there is truth in it. There is some nonfiction because the Dalton gang really did exist. Like, they even did all these things. One interesting fact about it is that I think the Dalton gang, as far as the timeline, like, they were only robbing for, I think, like, between 1890 and 1892. So it was like just a 2-year time span where all of this was happening. And when you're reading this book, like, you feel like they've been like outlaws forever.
Yes.
And another really interesting thing is that Emmett and Bob were just really young. Like, I think Emmett was still in his teens, like he was 19 by the end of the book, and then Bob was just like a couple years older. And I'm like, these really young teenagers being outlaws.
These babies.
But yeah, so it was really interesting. So for our next question, which kind of feeds into that, is what is your opinion of the Dalton gang, or more specifically the actions of Bob and Emmett? Do you agree with the teenager who spoke with Emmett at the beginning of the book, who said, "You don't seem very sorry about any of this. I mean, you murdered all those people." And then after that, in the beginning of the book, old man Emmett gets really upset and kicks him out.
Well, because I think, thinking back, I think obviously this was intentional, but it didn't seem like Emmett was the one who killed many people. I could be wrong. He probably did kill a couple people during their heists, but I definitely don't think he was one of those that was very, gun happy.
Yeah, like
Yes, yeah, Grant definitely was, or even Bryant. He definitely would be too. So I think he was, you don't seem very sorry about any of this. Well, no, he's not. He sold his rights as a story, so no, he's not sorry about what he did. That was his family. That was what they did, and so he's going to stand by his family. He probably got upset, kicked the teenager out because it wasn't just him, it was his family, and he's like, hey, yeah, I probably murdered people, but I'm not the worst one. That was probably his notion. So my opinion of the Dalton gang, obviously, I'm a good person, I think. So they were very naughty. I don't think they should have, but at the same time, that was their life. That's kind of all of the events leading up to them becoming the gang kind of pushed them in that direction. Frank being murdered, and then them being marshals, but then realizing that it's not all it's cracked up to be, and the temptation to turn outlaw was so strong that it's just like all those events leading up to it was like, well, of course they're going to become the Dalton gang. I don't know, they had the personalities and characteristics to pull some of this stuff off. I mean, Bob, for being so young, he had these crazy imaginations, and he was the one who commandeered all of these. He was the one who had friends everywhere that he could pull from different places and get these heists going. So it seemed the right path for them, unfortunately. Emmett, I think he was just following along until he realized he also enjoyed it himself. He was just following his brothers. Because what was there for him to go back to? I mean, there was Julia, of course, but Julia she seemed indifferent about what was going on. She like never shamed him, but at the same time never encouraged him. So she was just kind of like neutral. So, it just seemed like it felt that's where he belonged. Um, that's what I feel.
I would have kicked the teenager out too. I feel like it's just that the period of the Wild West and just the setting and the way things were, the way society was ordered at that time, rather unordered because it was a lawless area where there was no like anything to back up the law really except for a scattering of sheriffs. And so they only really got caught near the end because all these sheriffs, their name was famous enough to like draw in all these sheriffs, all these marshals to come into one place to fight them. But otherwise, I feel like there wasn't a lot of enforcement of the laws in place to create a structured society. So it let people take advantage of everything. So it wasn't just outlaws. It was the railroad. So I think a big aspect of it that with these gangs, that the normal people just living their everyday life thought these guys were heroes because they were stealing from like the rich corporations, and these rich corporations that were taking advantage of the farmers and just regular tradesmen. And so it was setting up an economic situation, I feel, where the people at the bottom were just getting nothing. And so it was seeing these outlaws taking advantage of that and stealing from the rich that I feel like made them into heroes just for regular people.
Mm-hmm.
Which you do get a little bit of that in the novel until the very end, because I think the bank heist is in a town that they grew up in, and people were like, why are you doing this here? And I think they actually got a couple of civilians killed, which I think Emmett was felt bad about at the end. But I think it was just a special situation. That was just the way things were set up there. So I feel like the teenager coming in and being like, oh, you killed all these people, aren't you sorry? It was just like the Wild West wasn't like that. It was just like you enforce things with violence. You just live by violence.
Yeah.
And so I would have kicked him out too. I would have been like, kid, goodbye.
You don't know my life. You don't know what I've been through.
As far as Bob and Emmett, like I thought they were really interesting characters. I mentioned a little bit about Bob in the beginning. One thing that really struck me is that because he was so young, the amount of personality and charisma that he needed to like lead this gang was amazing. So if you look up the pictures online after they've already been killed, which is a little gruesome, so you don't have to look up the pictures. But I was curious because I wanted to see what he looked like. And so they have all the bodies lined up. And so you have a bunch of these like older, grizzly outlaws, right? And then you have Bob, and he looks like a little angel-faced teenager. And I'm like, they were listening to this kid the entire time? Like he was like barely in his early 20s. So I just thought he was such an interesting character. Like he had such a personality that was beyond his years, I guess.
Yeah.
So for our next question is, what do you think about the women characters in the novel and Emmett's statement at the beginning of the book, which he says, and to leaven the wild tactics of hair-trigger men in hair pants, the story will also have the romantic presence of women, gentle, stoic, and tempestuous, whose lives are intertwined with the destiny of the outlawed Dalton.
Ooh, okay. Well, there were two female characters that really stood out to me. So there was obviously Julia, who was Emmett's sweetheart, as he would call her, and they had a relationship throughout the whole story. And then there's Eugenia Moore, who ends up being Bob's girlfriend and also an outlaw herself. She actually started out being a school teacher and was, I don't want to say seduced by Bob. I think she was just more seduced by the...
Well, she was an outlaw before she met Bob. I think that's why. I think she was bored. She didn't want to be a school teacher anymore.
Yes, I think that was, yeah, she was seduced by outlaw and thievery, and then she was drawn to the Dalton gang just because of probably their popularity and their presence throughout the different towns that they heisted. So you have two completely different women. You have Julia, where I said before she seemed kind of indifferent about the Dalton brothers. However, there were a couple points that you probably saw in the book where she warned the brothers when, I think it was her brother that was looking for them or was close on their trail. So she obviously had the strong connection to Emmett, and so in that she wanted to protect not only Emmett but his brothers as well. But to me, she was an angel. She was a good girl. She, I don't know what she did. She didn't do much. I just know that, whenever he talked about her, he idolized her, and that was his sweetheart. And she, like I said, she never got into the actual thievery. She was kind of on the outskirts of it. And then you got Eugenia, who is in the midst of it, who actually helped, was planning a lot of the heists, who went undercover as a man multiple times to get the intel. And she actually pretended to be someone's wife for a while to get more intel. And the idea is that she was the sixth man in the bank heist robbery because she dressed as a man, and then she kind of scampered off and skittered off, and we didn't hear from her after that. So it's interesting that you have two sides of the same coin. They both started out really good, and one drifted off into outlaw. So I think that's, probably what Emmett kind of means in his quote about there is a romantic presence of women, and both were entwined with the Dalton gangs, but in very different ways.
Yeah.
So you got two different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. So I thought, even though I thought Bob was an interesting character, my favorite character in this entire book was Eugenia, just because she was such an interesting person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she had a stable life. Like, she was basically, I guess, the version of middle class. And so she became a school teacher. She was teaching children, and she had what was then a few luxuries. Like, she had lavender soap, like all the nice things. And I really remember at the beginning when she's saying why she became an outlaw, and she was like, "Oh, my landlord asked me to marry him, and he was super old and grungy." And she was like, "I thought about it for a week, and then I had to stop and be like, what am I doing?" And then it's after that she became an outlaw because she was like, "I don't want to just live a life like that," which I thought was really interesting. And she was just super smart to go undercover and get all this information. She took advantage of the fact that she was a woman to trick people. The parts where she was getting information, the parts that Emmett was talking about, when he would recount her getting information, were so hilarious. She would go into these telegraph offices and pretend she was dumb and just take advantage of the fact that because she was a woman and because she was pretty, that people were like, "Oh, she's dumb." And they would just give up their secrets. They'd be like, "Here's the codes. This is what we do to signal when outlaws are here." It was just wow, you guys have no security at all. So I was really interested by her character, which leads into the next question, which is, what do you think happened to her? Because after Emmett goes to prison, she's sending him all these letters, and then before the bank heist, she faked her death because she thought they were going to get enough money to run off to Argentina, her and Bob. So she faked her death and pretended she had gotten cancer, and then she died. And then she joins this bank heist where everybody dies, and then Emmett goes to prison. And so then she writes letters back and forth to Emmett. And then eventually the letters stop. And then Emmett hears that she tried to rob a bank by herself in the middle of a blizzard and then got chased down and shot. And then I remember this line where he's like, that sounded too contrived, just like her cancer story.
Mm-hmm.
But he was like, I don't know if she's really dead.
Yeah, she faked her death a couple times, so it wouldn't be completely out of character for her to fake her, continue not going under the alias of Eugenia Moore, going under a different name, and maybe finding her way to Argentina or something. I don't know. It's hard. I think that's the idea of it, and it's open to interpretation. But then the other thing is, you and I had talked about this before, was she a fictional character? Was she inspired by a female that was in the Dalton gang that isn't talked about a lot? So you're going back and forth and you're wondering, what if, is she real, or was she just kind of that extra suspense, that extra person to have to make the heist seem more interesting and more exciting? Or was she a real character and she was just better than all of them because she was like a cat with 9 lives? She somehow survived through everything. So I would like to think that after she faked her death the first time and escaped from the bank robbery, I think she eventually made her way to Argentina, where she lived the life she wanted to with Bob. That's my little tie up with a little bow ending.
I want a book about her life after. Like, I want someone to write me a book so I can read it and be overjoyed by the rest of her adventures afterwards. Because I feel like it lends for a good story, with her being like heartbroken over Bob, but still being like super competent and amazing, and then maybe going to Argentina. So eventually getting to that ending. But I want more of her adventures. I liked her as a character.
Yeah.
So for our last question, how do you feel about the ending of the book and the cycle of Emmett Dalton turning from outlaw to Hollywood famous?
Well, obviously, when you first started reading it, you learned that he is the sole survivor. So you knew that eventually all the brothers had to die. And he even, I think, talked about the death of all the brothers right away in the beginning, and then he talked about their adventures. So you already knew going into it what was going to happen at the end. I was very upset that they met their demise at their famous, double bank robbery. I was like, oh, you guys could have thought this out better. This would have been great. But again, not spoiling it, we did find out that there was an ultimate betrayal by someone very close to the Dalton gang. So that probably led into their demise. However, I was kind of hoping there be a little bit more of, I don't know, I wanted him to just become an outlaw again at 65 years old and end his life the way he started it. But it felt very, underwhelming, considering all the build up into all the different heists. But again, it's just like any story someone is recounting. It's gonna have an end, and ultimately, it's going to be over. Like I said, I was very surprised with Emmett and just how much he missed his adventures, and how you can tell he just was not happy with. Probably happy with the money he has earned now, especially because he even said he earned more money making this movie than in any of the heists he had. And so he's kind of like kicking himself in the head, and he was like, man, this is crazy. But you could tell he misses the adventure. But again, it summed up everything we already knew. So it just felt like it was a roller coaster, and the roller coaster was over.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I feel like it lent a lot of truth and reality to the story, that he was a sole survivor and he lived a larger than life sort of Western story that was true.
Mm-hmm.
And then after it was over, it was just like he just became lost a little bit. Like, I remember in the end of the book, he's talking about when he was in prison, he was just the perfect prisoner. Like, he didn't do anything wrong. He just lived out his days, like, probably without a thought in his head. Because because I think that he just like probably was grieving his brothers and just the life that he had, and it was just like being lost. And then when he got out of prison, he was like, well, what do I do now? And then he just kind of fell into using his story to get money. So I feel like that was just a bit of reality, that sometimes after all of these adventures happen, sometimes you're just kind of lost afterwards, and it doesn't end with a bang. It just kind of just slowly die off. So I liked the ending of the book, sort of. Um, yeah, I felt it was fitting as well.
Yeah, no, it was overall a great story for those who would probably like to learn about a historical event along with adding fictional heists and everything, would probably really enjoy this book.
One thing I will mention, though, is if you like Westerns, you will like this book, but if you don't like reading about any sort of discrimination against Native Americans, or even people of color, because there were a couple of Black outlaws that I thought were really interesting, and I'm like, I want to know their stories.
Yes.
Or discriminatory against women, there's a lot of that. And if you don't like that kind of stuff, you will not like this Western book. But at the same time, I felt it was very true to the time period and the way people acted back then. So.
No, very, very good adding. No, that was a very good closing thought there. All right, well, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, for those who have watched it. Thank you, Tessie, for being awesome and having a great discussion with me. Please tune in next week, Friday, same day, same time, July 17th at 1 p.m. for APL Readers Corner. Next week is going to be a graphic novel. They're going to be reading Commute by Erin Williams. So definitely tune into that one. Also, don't forget, every Thursday at 1 p.m., we have our APL Mystery Reads, and that's where we have someone reading the first 15 minutes of a book, but they won't disclose the book title or the author until the end, and then they give a little book talk about why you might want to read this book. So that's something to tune into. We are still doing curbside at most of our Aurora Library locations. So if you miss the feel of a book, feel free to call the libraries or look up books in the catalog, place them on hold, and we'll contact you for curbside pickup. And that's all for today. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.